the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
This seminar is sponsored by BEM Systems, Brown and Codwell, and brought to you by the Stevens Institute Center for Environmental Systems.
Thank you for having me today. Again, my name is Stacy Kruse. I'm going to talk about sustainability and resilience planning at the local level. I'm going to dive into a few projects that I have worked on at Rutgers, specifically on resilience planning. But the constant theme throughout this presentation is basically going to be in this new era of, everybody's worried about climate change, but you have certain, there's a political divisiveness within it, kind of how you get through, how you approach these projects and how you get through these projects with all of that to take into consideration. So a little bit about my background, like Dib said, undergrad 2006 Rutgers, Poli-Sci and Urban Planning. I did my master's with a concentration in community development. I worked at the New Jersey State Planning Office right out of undergrad from 2006 to 2007. I then went to the Ocean County Department of Planning for about 5 years, and currently I'm at Rutgers University. I'm a licensed professional planner, a certified floodplain manager. I had considered a PhD in the past and even went as far as to interview a few professors, but then decided to get married and have kids instead. And I know there are a lot of people that do all of that together, but I'm not one of those people. So I maybe in the future, not yet. So again, I'm going to discuss some of the keys that have worked for me in terms of sustainability and resilience planning at the local level, in terms of strategically approaching your public and nonprofit officials to partner with on projects, strategically choosing agencies for collaboration, adjusting your scope of work if needed, managing client expectations, which is increasingly important, and then remaining open-minded and respectful in a divisive political climate. So I'll talk about some of the bigger projects I've worked on in the past that are not necessarily resilience related before I dive into some of the resilience stuff. So most of you seem to be too young to know what this is, but New Jersey used to have a state planning office that was called the Office of Smart Growth, where there was a cross-acceptance program that we brought towns through, and it was known as the Big Red Map. And it was very scary, and people protested at our meetings because what this process did was it prescribed certain planning areas throughout the state, and then it set development limits within those planning areas. So obviously, if you're a town looking for ratables or you're a private developer, that's not something that you necessarily want to see. Another program that I worked on at the state planning office was the plan endorsement program. So this was bringing towns into conformance with that state plan in terms of, does your master plan reflect this policy map? We worked on the development of planning centers. Planning centers allow more development and higher impervious cover. So this was pretty divisive in coastal communities where the level of development was already impaired and further impairing water quality. Next, at the Ocean County Planning Department, the two bigger projects that I worked on were the managing of the county master plan update, which I think was maybe 20 years old at the time that we updated it. I also managed the water quality management plan update for the county. Every county in New Jersey has to develop one of these plans. It either adds to or takes away from sewer service in areas. If you don't have sewer, you're on septic, so you can't build to certain densities. So this, again, can be a pretty divisive planning process. So I went to Rutgers University in 2012. One of my first big projects was working for FEMA, mapping and analyzing flood insurance payouts from Hurricane Irene, which had happened the year previously in 2011. So we were in the midst of this Irene project when Sandy hit. And then from then on, everything was Sandy related. So the bulk of my work, although I do work in transportation planning, some health policy issues, but the bulk of my work has been in future climate change, including heat, precipitation, storm surge, sea level rise. I'll go over the projections that I utilize in my work and how they're evolving, and then show you some accompanying web-based tools and guidance documents that I've developed or helped develop. And again, go into detail on some of the projects that I've specifically worked on. So a lot of the things that I do revolve around sea level rise and storm surge, because that's our climate impact here in New Jersey, a big one. So SLOSH is the sea, land, and hurricane mapping that is developed by NOAA. So we map the SLOSH and the sea level rise. Nonprofit agencies come to me and say, I'm working with a town, can you map this for me? I do it for certain towns for the NJDEP in a bunch of different projects. I help develop guidelines for and draft coastal vulnerability assessments for towns, and I'll go over a detailed one in a few slides. I create guidelines for and draft local climate adaptation plans, another example I'll have in the future slides. I've worked on green infrastructure planning, resilience elements, open space plans. Conservation lends itself to a climate adaptation strategy. And then the Getting to Resilience assessment, I help guide towns through this. And if anybody isn't aware of what that is, that was developed through NOAA and the NJDEP, along with a lot of state partners. And it's actually an online assessment tool that you as a facilitator can bring a town through and ask them a bunch of questions. And then at the end, it basically tells you, here's what you're doing and here's what you're not doing in terms of resiliency. It's usually the first thing that we do with towns in order to assess their level of resilience and what they're willing to do. So the projections that I use were developed by Bob Kopp. He's a professor at Rutgers. He is on the Science and Technical Advisory Panel at Rutgers. They are staffed by the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance. So what we've done in the past is you can choose central estimates or likely ranges for sea level rise, and then you have your low and your high emission scenarios. Generally, what we've done is we tell people we're going to plan for 1 foot of sea level rise in 2050 and 3 feet for 2100. And then those are our GIS layers that we use to then help plan with the cities, with the towns. Going forward, we're kind of shying away from those very concrete 1 and 3 numbers and moving more towards probabilities. So we'll sit with a town and say, here's your nearest tide gauge. We'll look at the tide gauge data and we'll say, 2100 is calling for this. So in that year, based on a likely projection, and then if a 1% storm hits, here's a total water level you're looking at. So it's not just going to be sea level rise, it's not just going to be storm surge, it's taking into consideration a bunch of different factors and giving out total water levels. So some guidance documents and web-based tools that I've helped develop. One particularly was funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and it's an online tool that a local planner or a town council member would use, where he would click through and find different ordinances that he can adopt or she can adopt, local planning policies that you can adopt, initiatives you can look into to help implement green infrastructure in your town. And this was specifically done for towns on the Raritan Basin, but it's applicable pretty much everywhere. I did a series of webinars for Together North Jersey, out of the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, one on green infrastructure and urban resilience, one specifically on how wetlands are impacted by and then can aid in climate change. And then again, I've just worked on some general guidance documents for the NJDEP, like what local planners can do for climate change, and how to make your communities more resilient. So again, going forward, since some of this stuff can be kind of touchy when you're talking about sea level rise, soliciting clients and writing your project scopes can be tricky. So I always want to, before I approach a town to work with them, I always Google where the mayor might stand on climate change, if the town has done any climate change work in the past, any resilience work in the past. And one thing that I found recently with a project was I Googled a new mayor of a town, and I think I just put in like climate change or climate adaptation next to his name. And the first thing that came up was an article where he said that he was going to let Jesus take care of it, and he didn't want to do any local climate planning. So, because I'm grant funded and my money's limited and my time frame for these projects are limited, that town was crossed right off the list, and I moved on. So you really have to know the political climate in the town you're preparing to work with. Find out what your client wants. So again, I work with mostly coastal communities that want to develop, but because of state regulations, they need certain permitting, and it becomes a little bit harder for them. So one thing that I try to offer them is, it's not an all or nothing thing. So maybe you develop in these areas, but we find a way to work in these resiliency aspects and these adaptation aspects that are more likely to get the support of the state and get you the permits that you need. It's important to educate yourself on the local population and demographics. So is there a poverty issue in the town? Is there a large senior citizen population, foreign-born populations, any public health concerns, et cetera? And then one story I have about that is after Sandy, the city of Sayreville was looking to do a large-scale buyout program, and there always needs to be like a cost-benefit analysis through the Army Corps and things like that. But a consultant went into the town, and he chose maybe a block or two, and he didn't really hold any public outreach at the beginning. He just went in, and in a design program, he wiped out all the houses and he put in green, because when you buy out the house, that's what happens to the area. It turns back into natural land. So then after the fact, this is being presented to the public. So they really had no context of what the project was about. They're sitting there like you guys, and they're looking at this screen, and all of a sudden their house disappears, and now it's just grass. And that local population in particular, I think they were first generation, primarily like Hungarian immigrants who had built those homes with their own two hands. So now this outside consultant's coming in, and with the click of a button, showing their houses being gone. So that was definitely an example of not knowing your local population and not knowing who your audience was and what they would likely support. And then lastly, and this is really important, is managing client expectations from the start. A lot of the work that I do with cities, they always ask for the flood wall, the floodgate, the complete realignment of this highway. We want to raise our whole downtown, these really big, expensive projects. And although you can talk about that, they can always be on a list of potential projects, but you need to let your clients know that just because a seawall might be a potential adaptation strategy, they're not going to leave that room thinking that they're going to get funding for that seawall just because this project is happening, because it does happen. So communicating that from the beginning is very important. So again, I think the word fact stirs up a lot of emotion these days. That shouldn't deter you from using science-based evidence in your work, but you also have to remember that you have to meet your clients halfway. So Democrat, Republican, believes in sea level rise or doesn't, you've got to meet everybody halfway. And one thing that I found to be helpful, especially with our sea level rise projections, is to use, again, these more ranges instead of these concrete numbers. Something that the client is comfortable with, because getting them to the table and starting this conversation is better than nothing. And some of our upper estimates include 12 feet of water for 2100. So for a lot of towns, that's just a non-starter, understandably, because under 12 feet of water, a lot of towns are not existing. So that's a quick way to lose people from the table. Don't talk down to people and use too much scientific jargon, and that's really easy for me because I'm not a scientist. And then again, just remember that there's always going to be critics and skeptics. I've literally had people tell me what a waste of time it is to work with climate change, and I should change my area of work. But simply having the conversation with somebody is a win, just starting that conversation. This is just a cartoon that I have hanging on my door at my office. It's Trump telling Pence, don't worry, I'm tweeting that climate change is fake. But this next cartoon is actually very applicable to my daily work. So the guy is saying, I used to agree with you that climate change was real until I found out how much it would cost to fix it. So a lot of the clients that I meet with will tell me, I'm not arguing with you. I know this is happening. We're seeing the impacts already, but I can't even get a new park built. You know, they don't want taxes raised for a new school. They're not going to want taxes raised for a resiliency project, especially something that you're telling me may not even happen until 2100. So that's something you'll encounter also. So just a couple examples of some projects where local officials were supportive. I did a climate adaptation plan in 2014 for Ventnor City. So they're in Atlantic County, literally in the shadow of Atlantic City. It was easy to work with them because we already had an established relationship through a partner agency where they had spoken about climate change in the past, so we knew they were willing to come to the table. And the results of this project were they used my work to ask for further grant funding for adaptation projects, and they also became the leader of the Atlantic Cape Coastal Coalition, which is very popular and very active in Atlantic and Cape May counties in lobbying for hazard mitigation projects that will help the whole region down there. So what this project entailed, I'll just kind of go over the sections of how I wrote the plan. I used the US EPA's climate adaptation definition. So society and ecosystems preparing for and adjusting to future climate change. And then, again, this was 2014, so there was not a ton of adaptation planning that was happening in New Jersey. So I went to NOAA's website and I found what they consider to be kind of the process of adaptation planning. And then I loosely, I took that and I transformed it into this little graphic, and then I based the chapters of my plan off of this graphic. So you lay out your future impacts, your vulnerabilities, your adaptation strategies, your implementation and co-benefits, and then how you plan on monitoring and updating the work. So first I always do a municipal overview, because you'll find that the people who are paying for you to do this work don't necessarily know what's going on in these towns and what they look like. So for Ventnor, for example, they have a population that fluctuates because they're a coastal town. And it was important to note the trends in the economy based on how Atlantic City's economy had changed over the years. So they would have, hotels and bed and breakfast and stuff that were generally full, but as the casino industry started to decline, their income started to decline as well. Again, call out any of the interesting demographics in the town. There was nothing too crazy in Ventnor. I did notice when I worked in Lavalette Borough that they had a very high rate of veterans who lived there, and I never really got the answer as to why. And that doesn't impact adaptation planning at all, but it was just something interesting to note. When you work in urban areas, you want to note that there's a population that probably doesn't have personal vehicles, and they're going to be relying on mass transit in terms of evacuation. So that's important to note when you're talking about areas that are flooding and certain areas that can be impacted. The next part of the climate adaptation plan was to actually lay out the vulnerability that we were referring to. So again, here it's going to be sea level rise and storm surge. If you're inland, it might be riverine flooding. If you're in Hawaii, it's going to be volcanoes. So whatever that hazard is that you're working on. Again, explaining the projections with maps and visuals instead of a lot of cumbersome jargon. Not saying skip over the text entirely, but people do like looking at visuals. So this, for example, is the town of Ventnor with 1 and 3 feet of sea level rise, which was the parameters we used for this plan. So they really stretched that the bottom, that's their ocean front there, is pretty well dune protected, and it's their back bay area that gets, a lot of the storm surge during events like Sandy, and their central low-lying residential areas. So when I presented this at a township planning meeting, I really wanted to give the residents who were there, and there were a lot of them, the context for what a category storm was that we were actually talking about. So Sandy, I think, was like right below a category 1 storm. So I went to the National Weather Service and I pulled up these characteristics of a category 1 storm. And I just asked my audience, have you ever seen this before, experienced this before? You'll notice that it says branches and trees will fall, the power lines will be down, the power will go out, it could be several days. So I'd ask them, do you have a generator? Do you think your local gas station would be able to provide fuel if you didn't have power for a few days? And this is just a good way of kind of bringing it down to the personal level so that people can relate. So then going on to show further vulnerability, I mapped Hurricane Sandy surge. This is a blanket level from USGS, a blanket data shapefile. So you can't click and identify certain depths. It's just showing you, the baseline where your surge was. So again, their ocean front's pretty well protected with dunes and higher elevations. And it's, the bay and lagoon areas. That's the impact. I also mapped their substantially damaged properties. So this is properties that they have to report to the state in order to get like post-disaster funding. Houses that are impacted, I think the rule is like above 50% of their market value. I also received from FEMA every insurance payout that was made to every policyholder in New Jersey from the inception of the program to whatever the month of this report was. So I think it's like 1973 on. And we aggregated those and we mapped those so we could show, who's getting damaged and who's putting in insurance claims. The only caveat with FEMA is that since it is private insurance information, they had us aggregate and map it at the block level. So there could be $1 million home, that makes the square red when it really only is that one home that may be impacted. But we do have to aggregate it and map it at the block level. So the next thing I did in this plan was I laid out some local, state, and federal regulations that the towns already have to do. So the first one is NJDEP's Coastal Vulnerability Index. This was something, it's not a regulation, this is more of a guidance document. It was very new at the time, so that was something that I did for them. But what is mandatory, obviously, is the FEMA flood zones and the firm mapping, the flood insurance mapping, and then local free board regulation. So I added into the plan what every town in Atlantic County had as their free board regulation. So at the time of this report, I think there's like 8 towns on this list that didn't have any. And Ventnor had 3 feet above the base flood elevation. So they were kind of already ahead of the game. And that was something they did immediately after Sandy. So then the final part of the plan is just to lay out local land use tools that the towns can employ to kind of combat all of this. So as a planner, I'm always immediately going to go to what's their land use development pattern, what does their zoning look like, and how much impervious surface do they have. So when it's raining, when these storms are coming, where's this water going? It's really important to reevaluate where your critical infrastructure is and then possibly moving it. And then lastly, I offered just a few green infrastructure techniques that they could use to aid in their downtown flooding and their nuisance flooding. So this map was the critical infrastructure that I mapped along with the sea level rise layers. So it's their municipal buildings, bus stops, fires, EMS, police, schools, evacuation routes, etc. And I think that they had moved 1 fire station post-Sandy because of damage. This was just something interesting that I thought, as a planner, you always look into historic districts and historic development. They have a historic district. Again, that's kind of their main drag along the ocean, their main street. Their historic properties that were oceanside were not really impacted, again, because it's a bit higher and they have that dune protection. But then their lagoon-side historic homes, which are kind of like really cute, quaint bed and breakfasts down there, were impacted. And I added into the recommendation report for them a report that a North Carolina town did that was specifically on resilience for their historic district. So that was something I recommended to them. A few green infrastructure techniques that I recommended to them were rain gardens. The left is their municipal building, which suffered some rain damage from Sandy. And as you can see, it's got a huge sidewalk. It's got a road that accommodates parking on both sides. So I showed them some EPA graphics of rain gardens along the street there where you're not losing, your sidewalk or your road. They have a massive parking lot in a strip mall that has that one sad little shrub there that could really use some landscaped islands and some trees. It's the parking lot, it's a road, and then it's the marsh which goes out to the bay. So there's also, oils from the cars that are most likely running off. So that was an area that we called out as needing a bit of help. And then the last example I'll show is the right is an example from the Chicago Green Alleys program, where they use permeable asphalt and plantings in their alleys. So like most smaller coastal communities, Ventnor has these kind of narrow buildings that are homes with multiple apartments or just apartment buildings or small retail buildings with these alleyways in between. And as you can see from the picture, you know, there's parts of the sidewalk that are stained. So there's likely water that's ponding, you know, it's flying right down the street. There's really nowhere for it to go. So I did recommend possibly employing the green alley technique in the town. I gave them some ways that they could go to choose the areas for green infrastructure. So they're areas with high impervious cover. They could immediately gravitate towards the areas of substantial damage or repetitive loss, or they could focus on their areas of nuisance flooding, which the map is from the Atlantic County Flood Hazard Inventory. So the county had already done that for them. Or they could layer all these and really, you know, narrow down an area or two. And then the report just concluded with a summary table I created of what each of these adaptation responses could be and what specific local planning document they could employ it from. And I included with each of these, when I could find it, possible grant funding that the town could look to, and then associated CRS points that they could get. So this is community rating system points through their flood insurance program, where the town building rain gardens on Main Street could actually get all of the residents a discount on their flood insurance. So that's usually a good sell for the towns. My next example is Ocean Gate in Ocean County, New Jersey. I did a coastal vulnerability assessment for them in 2007. The reason why the local officials were supportive was because they were looking to raise their boardwalk in town and build a new dune system, which would have required the Army Corps and permitting from DEP, and they knew I was working on this coastal vulnerability assessment project with DEP, so they said, you know, if you could do one here, we could start that conversation with DEP and talk about possible permitting. So that got me in the door. And then the result was, again, that really looped DEP in on their desires early on, which is always important when you're asking somebody for money and permitting. So again, I started the report off with just a CVA 101. I used this definition from DEP's New Jersey's Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Mapping Protocol. And this project, instead of just 1 and 3 feet of sea level rise, a GIS guy at DEP created a composite layer for me, which was the sea level rise projected for the year 2050, and then a Category 1 storm on top of that. And instead of just a blanket layer, I was actually able to go on the map and click at each area and find out exactly how much water would be in that area. So anywhere, you know, from 2 inches to 5 feet in some towns. So again, the community profile, Ocean Gate's pretty small, nothing too crazy going on there. The main point of this project was their boardwalk and beach, which is a river beach, and the homes that are located along it are very important to them. It's their ratables, it's their tourist attraction. There's actually a really nice beach. 65% of this boardwalk was destroyed during Hurricane Sandy, so that's what they're known for, and that's why they wanted help. So the methodology for the CVA, I do these in 3 steps. So first I identify the community assets, and then I establish the vulnerabilities and consequences to the hazard, and then I make recommendations. So step 1, identifying the assets. Again, this is a small town, 12 assets ranging from, you know, the ball field to the municipal pump station. And then we define it by an asset category. So is it a natural resource? Is it critical infrastructure? Is it a community resource? Is it a facility? And then we just list its function. You know, so it's a park, but it doesn't have bathrooms. So if a flood comes through, the bleachers might get a little damaged, but there's really no infrastructure damage there. So again, this is that 2050 sea level rise Category 1 storm composite layer over their assets. You know, so as you can see, the town pretty much would be inundated, aside from a small portion of the residential on the, I think that's the west side there. So again, I was able to go in and click on each of the assets and actually see exactly how much water would be there, and then assign a vulnerability and a consequences rating at each of those asset locations. So again, the ballpark had maybe a foot of water, and then you had more at the yacht club, more like 2 to 4 feet. This wasn't, you know, there was no real scientific method behind this. This was me talking to the town. They identified these assets. They told me what the consequences would be. I was just facilitating. This was a town-led plan. So the vulnerability rating is simply how vulnerable are they, how much water is there based on the function. The consequences is, how would this affect you as a town on a day-to-day basis? You know, if there's a foot of water on the ball field and the kids are missing a couple baseball games, it's not really, you know, going to break the town. But when there's 2 to 3 feet of water at your pump station, there's high consequences there. So the last step is just to offer some recommendations. So I pulled one from the report. And this can, if they get this Army Corps funding and they raise their boardwalk and they bury the utilities and they implant this dune system, great, they could still utilize this technique with or without that. But I told them to look into the Nature Conservancy's Restoration Explorer, which is an online tool where you go and you put in an area along the shore and it gives you how many and what restoration techniques could happen at these small areas along the shoreline. So, you know, breakwaters, beach restoration, things like that. So the last project that I'll talk about is just a handful of slides on a Newark urban climate project that I worked on. So the Ironbound Community Corporation, which is a CDC, had funding from Victoria to look into urban heat, and my office wrote a report for them. The heat conditions was the first section, so that was the report that I worked on. So I specifically wanted to define what these contributing factors to urban heat were. So I pulled these 4 factors from the US EPA. So, you know, what's causing urban heat? Reduced vegetation, the properties of the urban materials, so this is the roofing and paving, urban geometry, specifically the building footprint, and then the anthropogenic heat, so this is heat caused by human activity, transportation, heating, cooling, things like that. You know, I defined these factors, I hunted and found all of the available data sources and layers that I could that correlated to these factors, and then I produced a series of maps for the Ironbound Corporation. So in terms of reduced vegetation, I mapped for them the impervious cover and the tree canopy for the city. So I don't think there's any real surprise here. You know, the dark red is 80 to 100% impervious. So that's Port Newark, that's the airport, and that's their heavy industrial area. And then it's also no surprise that the tree canopy is basically non-existent there. And then on the western side of town, it's a bit heavier. It's 13.4% tree cover in the city, to be exact. For properties of urban material and urban geometry, we mapped the building footprint. So again, you know, they're absorbing more of the sun's energy, so that it's more cooling, more energy for cooling is needed. And, you know, you see the greater building footprint outside of the airport area. For the heat that humans are producing, obviously transportation is a big part of this, so I mapped the road network for Newark. And it was important to kind of pull out those the primary and the secondary roads, because we know that some roads are designated truck routes that are going to be, you know, polluting a bit more. Some roads are going to accommodate large volumes of traffic. Others are just going to be single lane. So I mapped all. It was about 370 miles of roadway contributing to the urban heat and emissions. Next, I mapped their industrial zones. So obviously the airport would be a contributing factor, and then all the way up to their heavy industrial and their port. The port is over 1,000 acres itself, so it's about 33% of the city is zoned for industrial. And then the last thing I wanted to do for them was talk about these populations that are vulnerable to urban heat, and then the structures they have in place that respond to them. So I think I took this from the CDC. So the 3 categories were the population 65 and over, children and adolescents, which are, you know, more prone to asthma, and then the low-income populations, which are going to have less resources to respond to heat emergencies. And then I thought it was important to call out what are the heat response variables that these populations would be able to either go to or have come to them. So I broke it down into the people and agencies that respond to people, or the places, the response places that these populations could go to. So I mapped the EMS, the fire stations, hospitals, police, and the public health departments, and then also the cooling centers in town, which the city keeps a pretty good inventory of. The public library, which always seems to be air conditioned and cool, recreation centers with pools, and then parks, which of course would only be great response locations if they have a decent tree canopy. And it was important to note that in Newark, a lot of their cooling centers are located in senior citizen, you know, towers, apartments, centers, so they're not open to the general public. They do have some, but most of them were senior citizen only. And then I don't have it, I didn't include the maps here, but I created buffers to those vulnerable populations and then these heat response variables. And I was able to pick out clusters that really had nowhere to go in terms of response to heat emergency. So I was told to make this about 40 to 50 minutes, and I'm right at 45, which is good. So just to recap, when doing this kind of resilience work, it was important with these towns and with the Ironbound to know our client and know the populations that we were working with. You know, you don't shy away from the science, but you want to take their local concerns into account. One important thing is to not make cookie cutter recommendations, because green roofs work really well in places like Hoboken, and then you go to a smaller town and they just, you know, it's not going to work for them. You know, like with Sayreville, buyouts are very popular in some towns, and in other towns they don't even want to talk about it. So your responses need to be different and need to be focused on that township, on their wants and needs. And then again, when you're identifying assets to include in this resiliency work, it's got to be a community-led conversation. We had a town that was very adamant that their local ice cream shop was one of their most critical assets. You know, it had been in the town and run for probably 3 generations, but I lived 2 hours away. I wouldn't have known that. So it's important that you let them tell you what's important and what they want to work on, and not kind of employ your own thoughts on them. Okay, thank you.